Okay, everyone, this is part two of adding a jQuery widget to your website. So in part one, we've sort of migrated all of the linkages, both the JavaScript linkages and the style sheet linkages into our file. So now in part two, we're going to actually bring in the base jQuery code to make this work. So once again, we're going to need to go back to our demo file, which I sort of have open right here. So if you go into the Fancy Box folder here, into the demo folder, and basically open up the index file, okay, you'll see that essentially we copied up to line 26 here. So now we're going to work on line 28 through, and this is a lot. We don't really need all of this, okay? So I'm going to bring it all in for now, but I think we're going to end up pulling some out in the end. We're going to do all the way to 208, okay? So what I'm going to do here is I'll copy 208 all the way up to 28. So that's a lot of code. And you'll see how much we streamline this in the end, okay? So we're going to copy that. I'm going to say edit, copy, okay? And then I'm going to go back to my file here, which is the index file. And I'm going to paste this after, okay, my style sheet. So down below is my style sheet right here, okay? And I'm going to place it in between the closing style tag and the closing head tag, okay? So I'm going to paste that in. So that's going to be another script, okay? And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up to the top here and I'm going to talk about how this works, all right? So I went a little too far. So here we are right here. Okay, so here's where it starts, so to speak. You'll see here's my script tag, right? And then basically what we have is the first thing we have is this line right here. Now, why jQuery is so genius in the way it works is that one of the major problems in JavaScript is that JavaScript often has a problem of referring to things in a browser that it wants to affect with its code. So, for example, if you want to do something to a video, right, you have to refer to that object in the browser, okay? And essentially, in JavaScript, if you look at the history of JavaScript, there was often a problem of how to refer to objects in different browsers, and you had to use different grammar for different browsers. So, for example, Chrome and Safari tend to use the same browser. Firefox, for a very long time, when it was Netscape Navigator, used a different grammar, and then that switched over, and now it uses a standard grammar. But Internet Explorer uses a completely different grammar. So the coder or the programmer would have to write alternative JavaScript for each of these environments so that it would work in all the environments. And that made it a pretty steep learning curve for anybody who was doing this as a professional programmer. Now, libraries like jQuery came along and kind of simplified that whole process by giving people a very familiar way to refer to an object. So everybody here understands, and we've talked about this, the rules regarding making CSS selectors. So for example, what do you use to create a selector? You can create a class by using a period in the selector name. You can create an ID by using a hash mark in the selector name, right? You can use an HTML tag to create a selector name. You can make combinations of those things. And every designer who designs websites knows about those selector rules. So what jQuery did was they took that rule base of identifying objects that you're going to affect with the script and implemented that in their library. So the way you refer to an object is by its CSS selector. Okay, and this is a very smart approach. Now, the way jQuery works is when the page first loads, you always have what I have highlighted here on line 142. You always have a document ready function. Now, what this does is it actually looks at the whole document and analyzes the structure so that it can understand what you're referring to when you start referring to these selectors in the actual code. So when you see a $ in jQuery, that actually means query. So what does query mean? It actually means to search or to organize or to look at a structure, right? So you query a database, right? You search a database, okay? So what this is doing, it's saying look at your whole document and query the whole document. And then after you do that, say I'm ready to go and start the process. So that's the first thing that every jQuery library is always wrapped inside this document ready function, which is what we're looking at here. Okay, now on line 147 is our first real line of jQuery. Now the way this works in JavaScript grammar is that JavaScript is often a series of statements separated by periods, and those separations designate the grammar of how JavaScript is written. So for example, in JavaScript, the first thing you have is always the object, so it's a thing that you want to affect, right? Then you have a period. Then you have here what's called a method, or in this case, it's an action. So you identify a thing, and then you identify an action on that thing. So in this case, what we're going to do is think about what you know about CSS selectors. Right here, you have this dot fancy box. Well, we already know that the dot means in CSS selector language that a dot means it's going to be a class, right? So what this is saying is it's saying query or look for my entire document and look for anything that has a class called fancy box on it. And when you find those things, apply this action or this command called fancy box to it. Now this command fancy box is defined in one of the jQuery linkages that we made up above in the header section in the previous exercise. Okay, so this line of jQuery is actually saying look through my whole HTML document, look for anything that is a class, and when you find it, apply this action that's defined in the jQuery library that we linked to called fancy box, which in essence pops up the screen and makes the background dark, okay, in this particular widget. So that being said, okay, that's sort of how this widget works. Now every widget's going to work a little different, okay, not all of them are going to be exactly alike. One thing you have to look at is you have to actually look at how the actual jQuery is implemented in the HTML, because probably the library for the widget that we linked to above is going to look for a certain HTML setup in order to be able to implement that. So if we go back here, now that I have this all pasted in, okay, if we go back to our demo file, so here's fancybox demo HTML. Now that we copied all this in, what I want to do is I want to actually scroll down to the body section here, and I want to look, remember this file, okay, so this is the file that we're actually looking at here, right? This is it. And remember, if you click any, we're going to focus on the simple image gallery. If I click any one of these, you see how it pops it up, okay? So that being said, here's the body section where all that starts. So we have the title, fancy box, we have this paragraph here, and then we have this H3 tag, right, simple gallery. And then you'll see here, here's the important thing. So we have an anchor tag that has a class called fancy box. Now that should ring a bell because that's what we defined up above in our jQuery, right? And that links to an image, which is a bigger version of the image, okay? So we need to put that structure into our HTML file in order to be able to simulate or make this widget work in our file, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back here to my index, and I'm going to scroll down a bit, okay, all this stuff here, and here is the actual, that's the one on top. Down here, here is the subnav that we're working with. Now I notice that this subnav does not have an actual anchor tag on it. So if I go and look at this really quick, here it is, okay, you'll notice that we have these guys here, right? Now, right now, I roll my mouse over them and I don't see the little hand come up, which tells me that they're not links, right? So if I want to make these links, I need to actually put that code in. So we should go through that process now. So what I'm going to do here is I have this right here. I'm going to go and I'm going to add in a href equals quote. And I want to point to a graphic, okay? Now, I took the liberty of downloading a bunch of graphics earlier, like I said, and they're located in a folder called images. So there's that folder right there, images. And since our first one is electronic, I'm going to link to the file called electronic.jpg, right? And then I'm going to put in my closing. Now, because we already have code here, brackets is going to kind of put in the closing anchor tag before the image. We need that to be after the image, right? So I'm going to delete that. and then put that in right there. Okay, now we're going to do the same thing for all of these. So I'm going to start that process. I'll do the same thing, a href equals quote, and I'll go here into my images folder, and I'm looking for hip hop. So there's hip hop, and I'll put my closing here, delete that closing anchor tag, and I'll put in here my a like so. Okay, right? And then I'm going to do the same thing here, right? So I'm just going to go ahead and do all these, okay? And just make sure you look at the image so you know which one do you choose. So there's R&B, right? And we'll say back on that, delete that, and put my closing anchor in. Oh, it's not there. Sorry. It's there. Okay. And two left. So I'll say href equals quote. And this is indie. So I'll go into images and I'll choose indie. Right. Delete that closing anchor tag. And go after the graphic and put that in. And then finally I have one left. So we'll say href equals quote. Sorry, not fancy box, my bad. Image, right? And the last one is classical, so we'll choose classical, and I'll put that in. And finally, I'll put my closing anchor tag, right? Okay. So now that I've put in all of these links, okay, and I'll just save that all really quick, right? And now you'll see, let me bring this back here. You'll see if I roll over this, now each one of these is a link, right? So right now I have the groundwork to make this clickable. Okay, so that's important. Now the second thing we need to do, if you remember back in our demo file here, not only did we have an anchor tag around the image, but we had this class fancy box on there. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy that to make my life easier. And I'm going to go back to my designed file here, and I'll just say paste. And I'm going to put that in on every single one of these, like so. Right? Okay. So now if I save this and bring this back in here, just want to make sure, there we go, right? And now if I roll over this and click, you'll see there's my fancy box effect, right? So if I do this one, there's that. If I do this one, there's that, okay? And if I do this one, there's that, so on and so forth, right? Okay, so just even in a basic sense, I have this working at this point.